landscaping, with snow removal. All right, we'll say good morning. Let's begin. Wait. All right. Let's begin. So today's daf is daf Yud. We left off on the bottom of Tes Amud Beis. So again, just to reorient ourselves, we left off in the case of the Succah Agabe Succah, and the four different cases that came up. So remember, we left off Pa'amim Sheshtein Ksheros. We left off that there are sometimes when both sukkahs are kosher, sometimes both sukkahs are pasul, sometimes top one is kosher, bottom one pasul, sometimes bottom one kosher, top one pasul. So the Gemara says the following. So the Gemara is going to go through each of these cases and discuss exactly how it is that they play out. So Pa'amim Sheshtein Ksheros Heichi Dami. So what's the case where both sukkahs are kosher? Heichidami, what's the case? Kigon shetachtona chamosa miruba mitzilasa. The case would be the following: the bottom one allows in more light than shade in its schach. V'ha'alyona tzasa miruba mechamasa, and the upper one is more shade than light. In other words, the bottom one's schach is not really kosher by itself. The upper one's schach is kosher by itself. The kaima alyona besoch esrim, and the schach of the upper sukkah is within 20 amos of the ground. That way, again, essentially, the upper schach functions as the schach for both the upper sukkah as well as the lower sukkah. That's when both of them would be kosher. Pamim sheshtein psulos. There would be a case where both sukkahs are pasul. Hechi dami, what's the case? Kigon titarvaihu silasan miruba mechamasan. The case would be the following: when both sukkahs provide more shade than sun, the kaima elyona lemala me'esrim amma, and ultimately the upper sukkah is more than 20 amos tall from its floor, meaning from the schach of the bottom sukkah, which then ultimately means that you have non-kosher, which you have schach that's lemala me'esrim amma, providing shade on the upper sukkah and the lower sukkah, which means the upper sukkah is pasul, the bottom sukkah is pasul. There are times when the upper sukkah is kosher and the lower sukkah is pasul. When is that? Heichi dami. What's the case? Top of Yud. Heichi dami. So the Gemara says, Kigon, Shatachtona Silasa Meruba Mechamasa. So again, remember, this is the case where the bottom one is kosher, upper one will be pasul. What's the case? Kigon Shatachtona, the bottom sukkah, Silasa Meruba Mechamasa, its schach provides more shade than sun. The Elyona Chamasa Meruba Mitzilasa, and the upper one provides more light than shade. So in other words, the schach is not really good. V'kaimi Tarvaihu Besoch Esrim, and ultimately, again, both are within 20 amos of the ground. That way, in that case, the bottom one will be kosher, and ultimately, the lower one will be kosher, the upper one will be pasul. Upamim shal yona kshera v'tachtona pasula. And there are times when the upper sukkah will be kosher and the lower sukkah will be pasul. Heichi dami, what's the case? Kigon tetarvaihu silasan meruba mechamasan. Case where both sukkahs, the schach provides more shade than sun. The kaima elyona bisoch esrim. And the upper sukkah is within 20 amos of its own floor, but obviously, again, its schach is lemala me'esrim for the bottom one. Okay, so we'll say, to which the Gemara essentially says, Pshita. All of these cases are straightforward. I mean, we'll say, there's no chidushim in any of these cases. Essentially, what the Gemara is saying is, depending on how you create the variations, lemaisa, again, sometimes the upper one is kosher, bottom one's kosher, upper one's pasul, bottom one's pasul, both kosher, both pasul. It all depends on just how you arrange the case. But there's no novelty in these particular rulings, which the Gemara says, I'll tell you the novelty. Tachtona kshera ve'elyona psula itzrichale. I'll tell you the case that's the chiddush. The chiddush case is the case of where the bottom one will be kosher and the upper one will be pasul. I'll say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Tachtona kshera ve'elyona psula itzrichale kedekaima elyona besoch chav. So if you remember again, this was the case of the bottom sukkah that's kosher and the upper sukkah that's pasul. So remember what that case was? That case was where again the upper sukkah has chamasa mirov mitzilasa. The schach allows in for more sun than shade, and it's besoch esrim, and it's within 20. Therefore, again, the upper sukkah is pasul because again it doesn't have proper schach, but the bottom sukkah is kosher because the schach of the bottom sukkah ultimately has proper schach attached to it, and the upper schach does not invalidate it. So the Gemara says that was a necessary case. Why? Itzrichale, ma'u detemu, what would I have thought? Nigzar dilma mitztarev schach pasul, bahade schach kosher. I might have thought that case should still be puzzle. Why? Because Lemaisa, at the end of the day, perhaps you are including schach puzzle together with your schach kosher. Meaning, Abosai, that I might have thought that that the schach puzzle contributes ultimately again to the schach kosher. Kamash Mulan, that we're not worried about. Kamash Mulan will say that even though there is some level of schach puzzle, that's the lamala me'esrim the chamasim mitzilasa. We don't care about that. Rather, we just simply focus on the fact that the bottom sukkah indeed has the requisite shear for its schach. Okay, so the Gemara says the following. So we'll say, see, here's what we've established.
Seems to be different than the tree case where we required you to bring down the branches.
So lemaisa, so that's a good point. Lemaisa, as I mentioned yesterday, we don't paskin that way, right? We don't paskin that you require. But that's why if you build your sukkah underneath a tree, we don't require that you put your branches in underneath the schach. If you can, that's great. But lemaisa, the way we paskin is that as long as there is the majority of shade coming from the kosher schach, we do not worry about the overhang. So too over here, lemaisa, this is clearly a case of an overhang. We don't worry about that. And that's the Chiddush. So the Gemara says the following. Now remember, so just to keep this in mind, the Mishnah began with a statement that Sukkah al gabe Sukkah is puzzle. Now what the Gemara is going to do is define the minimum case of Sukkah al gabe Sukkah, meaning what constitutes a double-decker Sukkah? How much distance must there be between the bottom Sukkah and the upper Sukkah? You understand, as I mentioned yesterday, in this case, the schach of the bottom Sukkah serves as the floor for the upper sukkah. But the shaila is, how much space do you have to have between essentially the schach of the bottom sukkah and the schach of the upper sukkah for the upper sukkah to be considered its own sukkah? Now, you'll say to yourself, who cares? Who cares? So why does it matter? Because whatever that amount is, when it's less than that amount, one can make the cogent argument that what? That it's all one sukkah. That it's all one sukkah, that therefore, again, that upper part should seem to be bottled to the lower part. So now we need to know what are the minimum dimensions of a sukkah al gabi sukkah. What are the minimum dimensions of that upper sukkah to make it a separate and distinct entity? So the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, Kama yehe bein sukkah l'sukkah, utehe tachtona psula. How much distance is there between one sukkah and the other to have the upper one, to consider the upper one be possible? Amar Rav Huna, tefach. So we'll say Rav Huna literally says that as long as there is a tefach, and remember, what we're really measuring over here is not as much surface area, because surface area, we know that's Zayin al Zayin, right? But what we're really measuring over here is what? Is height. Is height. So Rav Huna says there has to be at least a tefach of height. Now, where does he get a tefach from? So this is a very interesting case. Shekin matzinu ba'ohel tuma tefach. Because the minimum shear of an ohel, of literally a tent, for tumah purposes, is a tefach. Is a tefach. I'm sorry?
Is that what we saw with the mattresses when you try to raise the floor, and if you're, but the tzroros, if you're mevatel, the tzroros.
Oh, the teven, right. Correct. No. That was the case of tumah, but this case is a little bit different. That was the case, you're talking about. That was for containing tumah. Correct. So actually the truth is it's a similar concept. Here we're talking more what's the minimum definition of an ohel. So the Gemara says the following. Shkimatzino betuma tefach tesanya. Listen to this. Tefach al tefach barum tefach. If you have an object that is 1 tefach long, and again, how much is a tefach? A tefach is about 3.5 inches. About 3.5 inches. So if you have an object that is 1 tefach long by 1 tefach wide, berum tefach with 1 tefach of height, mevi as hatuma v'chotzeitz bifnei hatuma. It has the ability to spread tuma, and it also has the ability to serve as an ohel to contain tuma. So also, let me give you an illustration. So let's say, for argument's sake, this was a tefach by a tefach by a tefach, and now there's a tamei object underneath it. So let's say again, here's my tamei object. So this does 2 things. Number one, what it does is anything else that's underneath this roof, so to speak, together with the tamei object, becomes tamei itself. So okay, so if this is the tamei object and I have another object over here, this second object will also become tamei. What else? What else is this tefach by 1 tefach height? If something is on top of it, right, it prevents the tumah from going up. Okay, so therefore, what do you see from here? So what Rav Huna essentially is saying is, aval pachos mirum tefach, but if you're saying that's less than a tefach high, lo mevi v'lo chotzitz, it does not allow the spread of tumah underneath it, nor does it obstruct the ascension of the tumah upwards. So what do you see from here, according to Rav Huna? That lemaisa, a tefach is the minimum shear for an ohel. For a structure. So therefore, again, Rav Huna will say, therefore, if you're going to have a sukkah, gabi sukkah, the minimum height requirement for an upper sukkah to be considered its own sukkah, not bottled to the bottom one, is 1 tefach. On the other hand, Rav Chisda of Rabba bar Rav Huna Amri, Arba'a. Rav Chisda and Rabba bar Rav Huna say, no, the upper sukkah must be 4 tefachim tall in order for it to constitute its own separate shear. Shalomatzinu makom chashuv pachos mi'arba. Why Rabba said? Because we know the minimum dimensions for rishus, for a separate domain, let's say this is for Shabbos purposes, is how much? Is 4 tefachim. So therefore, again, that upper sukkah can't be considered its own separate domain unless, of course, it satisfies the minimum dimensional requirements for rishus, which is 4 tefachim. Good.
Even though it's a puzzle sukkah, right? Just by height.
Correct, but that's the chap. It only becomes a puzzle sukkah if it has the identity of a sukkah. And the shaila is, what's the minimum identity of a sukkah? Now remember, we know area-wise that it's zayin al zayin, but that's obvious because it's already sitting on top of a proper sukkah, which means it's got to have at least that same area. The shaila is, what's the height dimension that allows it to be a separate sukkah, which you're right, which you're correct, which then makes it into a puzzle sukkah. Remember, Abbas, I want to be clear. In this case, not satisfying the dimensions would actually work in our favor. Not satisfying the dimensions would actually what? What would it do? It would make it, right, it's nothing, essentially. Meaning, when we say it's nothing, it makes it part of the lower sukkah. So remember, we're trying to see, when you said sukkah gabi sukkah is puzzle, we're trying to see what is the minimum dimensions of the upper sukkah that would render it puzzle. So the Gemara goes weiter. One more. Shmuel says asara. Shmuel says 10 tefachim. I will say this is the most mistaber. Why? My time with the Shmuel. Meaning again, I will say height of 10 tefachim. Shmuel says kech sheira kach psula. Mahach sheira ba'asara. Af psula ba'asara. So once Shmuel comes along and says, what are you guys hacking around for? Again, we have the dimensions for sukkah already. So why should this upper sukkah be any different than the lower sukkah? The minimum height dimensions for a sukkah are 10 tefachim. A sukkah must be also just in practical terms. What that means is minimum height dimensions for a sukkah is about 3 feet. Sukkah has to be at least 3 feet. So Shmuel says, just like a regular sukkah has to be 3 feet, in order for this upper sukkah to be considered its own separate domain, it must also be 10 tefachim. Tanan, the Gemara brings a Mishnah. Tanan, Rabbi Huda says, actually from our Mishnah, im ein diur in be'alyona hatachtona kshera. I will say now the Gemara is going to try to figure out who is first. So we have 3 different shitos then in terms of what are the minimum dimensions for the upper sukkah. Remember, there's a very specific case of sukkah gabi sukkah. What are the minimum dimensions of the upper sukkah that would render the bottom sukkah puzzle? Again, leaving aside all the variables that we discussed earlier, lamala me'esrim, pachos me'esrim, what the nature of the schach is, but what's the case of sukkah gabi sukkah that can render the bottom one puzzle? So remember, 3 shitos. Rav Huna, tefach, Rav Chisda Rav Huna, 4 tefachim, and Shmuel, 10 tefachim. Now we have to try to figure out who's right. So Gemara says, Tanan, Rabbi Huda says, im ein diurin be'alyona hatachtona kisheira. So Rabbi Huda says, remember this is Rabbi Huda in the Mishnah. Rabbi Huda said, if there's no one living in the upper sukkah, so the bottom sukkah is kosher. So the Gemara says, my ein diurin. What does that mean? No one's living in the upper sukkah. What does that mean for us? So the Gemara says, Ilema diurin mamish. If you say that it literally means residence, atu diurin kagarmi. Does the presence or lack thereof of residence in the upper sukkah in any way determine the nature of the psul or the kashrus of the sukkah? Elalav, listen, elalav, my indian. Rather, what does it mean? No one lives in the upper sukkah. Kol she'ena ru'uya l'dira. Rabbi Huda was saying, if the upper sukkah is not fit for dwelling, then it does not go ahead and render the bottom sukkah puzzle. So the Gemara says, "Vehechi dami." And what's the case? What's the case where you would say that the upper sukkah is not fit for dwelling? De lo gavoa asara. It must be what? A case of where the upper sukkah is not 10 tefachim tall. And Rabbi Huda is coming along and saying what? That if it's not fit for dwelling, if it's not 10 tefachim tall, then the upper sukkah does not invalidate the bottom sukkah. Oh, now here's the problem. Remember, what did the Tanakama say about sukkah gabi sukkah? The first page in the Mishnah, what did the first page in the Mishnah say? Puzzle. And it didn't qualify that statement. So the Gemara therefore says, Michlal, in the end of the first wide line on Yud Amud Aleph, Michlal, the Tanakama Savar, Af Api She'ena Ru'uya L'Dira Psula. The Rabbi say, the Tanakama just gives a straight up psul, which seems to indicate that the Tanakama would hold that even what? Even if the upper sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, then what? Then Lamaisa, again, the sukkah would be unfit, the sukkah would be pasul. So we'll say that obviously is a contradiction to Shmuel, because Shmuel said that again the upper sukkah is only problematic if what? If it's lamala me'asara. Tanakama seems to indicate that it's possible even if it's pachos me'asara. Ki asar Ravdimi Amri b'ma'arava. This is very interesting. I will say when Ravdimi came along, he said, "What does it mean when we say that if the upper sukkah is not fit for dwelling, it does not invalidate the bottom one? What it means is what it means to say, Rabosai, is that if the floor of the second sukkah, which is the schach of the bottom sukkah, is not strong enough to be able to hold kara v'kistos, means pillows and mattresses. In other words, what is it saying? If it's not strong enough to operate as a floor, right? If it doesn't have a floor, then lemaisa what? Essentially, what they used to say in Ma'arava in the West is Eretz Yisrael. Well, the way they understood this mission in Eretz Yisrael is if the schach of the bottom sukkah is not strong enough to serve as a floor for the upper sukkah, then lemaisa, the upper sukkah is not what? It's not a sukkah. It's not a sukkah. You can't have a sukkah without a floor. And therefore, lemaisa, again, remember, once the upper sukkah is not kosher, then what? The bottom sukkah but pashtos will be. Again, all of this is dependent on the variables that we spoke about earlier. But just in the abstract, it will be kosher. Michlal, the Tanakama Savra Apapi She'ena Ru'ya L'Kabel Psula. Then I will say, remember, the inference from this is what? Is that Lamaisa, the Tanakama would say that even if, remember the Tanakama just across the board says that the bottom sukkah is pasul, which seems to indicate that the Tanakama would hold that even if the schach of the upper sukkah, of the bottom sukkah, was not strong enough to serve as a floor for the upper sukkah, the bottom sukkah would still be pasul. To which the Gemara says, "My afapi she'enu lekabel." I'm sorry. Ikabinahu dichola lekabel al yedei adchak. This is very interesting. So, what's the practical difference in Rabbi Yehuda and Tanakama? If lemaisa, the schach of the bottom sukkah could support the mattresses and the pillows, but what? Aydiat chak means what? Under duress. Meaning, Avosai, that essentially you're kind of tiptoeing. Right? Every single time you're saying tefillas haderech, for every single step you take on that schach, because you do not know what's going to happen the moment. So again, look at Rashi for just a moment. This is the last Rashi before the Mishnah. O mishani ika beinayu. The Rabbanan Savri, Kevan diachola lekabel bedochak shem sukkah ahal yona. So we'll say the Rabbanan hold that even though it's not the best setup, technically the schach of the bottom sukkah, which is the floor of the upper sukkah, could sustain the weight of the mattresses and since technically it could, although again it's very what's the right word? Tenuous. Good. It's very tenuous, right? I'm sorry. You could build it up, correct? But the shaila is looking at what it is now. It's very tenuous. So the Rabbanon will say, look, that's still called a sukkah. It's still called a floor. It has the ability technically to support the weight. And therefore, the Maisa, the upper sukkah has the identity of a sukkah. And once the upper sukkah has the identity of the sukkah, the bottom sukkah becomes pasul. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda, I'm reading in Rashi, Rabbi Yehuda says, Kivan deleka tashmisha lahedja lav shem sukkah Allah de alyona. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, holds what Rabbi will say, that Lamaisa, no, sukkah, remember, the way you live in your sukkah has to resemble the way you live in your home. And since Lamaisa, again, a person would not construct a floor like that in their home, therefore, Lamaisa, again, such a floor like that does not work in your sukkah either. So what it comes down to, according to this last verse, is something very interesting, that really the question is the floor suitable for normative, when I say floor of the second sukkah, which is the roof of the which is the roof of the bottom sukkah, is it usable for normative dwelling? According to Rabbi Yehuda, if it's not, that even if you could use it in a tenuous situation, Rabbi Yehuda, that does not constitute a real floor, and therefore, again, we don't view the upper sukkah as being significant, and therefore the bottom sukkah will be kosher. According to the Rabbanon, if you could use it at all under any circumstance, even idea dochak, even in a tenuous situation, lemaisa, that's called the floor for the upper sukkah. Upper sukkah is kosher, and ultimately, again, bottom sukkah is possible. Okay.
Is it no longer a question of Shmuel?
Is it no longer a question on? Well, it's just now saying that lemaisa, instead of just, there's more than just a height requirement. That's the Gemara saying over now. You thought that the whole issue was just the height requirement. Height requirement is only part of the discussion. There's another piece of discussion in terms of now the durability of the floor. So it started out as a kasha of Shmuel, turned out now to be not a kasha on Shmuel, but simply a different issue in totality.
I think since the Mishnah says Sukkah, on top of Sukkah, they assume that the upper one is the actual.
Is a real sukkah. Is a real sukkah, right? True. All right, Tabos Mishnah. Well, say this is a great sugya. Now, a very good sugya. They're all good sugyas. So the Gemara says the following. The Mishnah says, Pires aleh sadin mipnei achama. If you go ahead, we'll at the end of this sugya, we'll do a little bit of halacha today, time permitting, but we'll also go back to some of the sugya regarding ha'oses sukaso tacha sa'ilan, because that's probably one of the most halacha l'maisa sugyas about building your sukkah underneath a tree, and because again, that's the Mishnah we did yesterday. So I'll show you the Shulchan Aruch, God willing, tomorrow. So if we have time, maybe we'll do a little bit of it today. So the Mishnah says the following: Piris aleh sadin mipnei achama. Mishnah Yud Amud Aleph. If a person goes ahead, it's a very interesting case. You put a sheet over your sukkah because of the sun. So what you're essentially doing over here is you're like an umbrella. So you're putting, literally, it's hot, and you're putting a sheet. This is on top of the schach in order to block out the sun. Okay. O tachteha mipnei hanesher, or you spread out a sheet underneath your schach in order to what? To catch the the leaves. Depending on what kind of. Let's say if you ever cut down willow branches to use for a schach, so you'll notice again about 2 hours after you do it, it's dry. Right? It's already falling down. So again, you go ahead. It looks very pretty, when you're cutting it down and you're holding it back, and then when you put it up. Okay. In any event, you have a. Yeah, exactly. So you're spreading a sheet out underneath the schach to go ahead. I was going to say to collect the droppings, but that doesn't sound right. To collect the leaves that are falling off. Okay. Or for that matter, shepires al gabe hakinof, or you're placing a sheet on top of bedposts. Now, both take a look at Rashi over here for just a moment. Rashi says, Al gabe kinov, hein dalid kundisin lidalid ragle hamita, v'govhin, umaniach klenusos mizeh lezeh al gabein, u'prois le'sadin. So let me show you something. So you have over here, should have made you look. So this is a serious sukkah dweller. He's not bringing in a cot. He's bringing in again his canopy bed. Okay. So now again he's got his bed.
He's got a sheet on that.
Yes, he has a canopy now on top of that bed. This is what's called Rabosai. This is what's called a kinov. Shapiris agabe kinov. 4 posts, canopy on top. Psula. In all of these cases, what you have done invalidates it doesn't invalidate the sukkah. I should take that back. What it does is it doesn't allow you to fulfill your mitzvah in the current state of dwelling. Look at Rashi. Psula mishum de'eno yoshe b'sukkah de'ohel mafsik beinehem. So you're saying all of these cases. Remember, and now you have 3 different cases. The schach, the sheet on top of the schach to block out the sun. The sheet below the schach to go ahead and catch any stuff that's falling from the schach, and the canopy on top of the bed. In all of these cases, when you're sitting underneath these sheets or these canopies, you are no longer sitting within the shade of the sukkah, but rather you're sitting in the shade of the sheet. And therefore, the Maisa, that invalidates the sukkah. Again, I'm careful with saying that it invalidates the sukkah, because the truth is technically the sukkah itself is not invalidated. The sukkah itself is a good sukkah. There's something obstructing you. It's like a right? It's like a chatzitza almost. There's something that's obstructing you, because only reason I say that is because when we go ahead and we use lashon of psul, so psul usually means there's something wrong with the chavtza, with the object of the sukkah. Here, yes, you could if there's a sheet on top of it, there's something wrong with the object, but not really, because as soon as you remove the sheet, the object itself is perfectly fine. In any event, you can't fulfill your mitzvah of sukkah with it. Aval, porisu agabe naklite hamita. But what can you do? You can spread a sheet literally on bedposts. And I will say, now what's this case? This is a case of where, instead of 4 posts on the bed, if you can imagine, there are 2 posts on the bed. I'm just showing Noam because he's right next to me. Right? There are 2 posts on the bed. So what happens, again, and these posts would be situated by the head and the foot on the bed, in the middle. So essentially you create like a tent. Now what's the chap of that? Why is that better than the case of the 4 posts? So listen to this. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, it's only 2 posts. They yotzin be'emtza. One post is by the head, one post is by the feet. The nosin klusa mizel is a person on sudden. V'hu mishafei lechan ulekan umishum de'in lagag tefach rochav lemalo lo mikriol. Also, listen to this. The halachic definition of a tent, or I should say differently, of a tent or of a roof is there must be at least 1 tefach, a flat space. So if you build a tent like this with no flat roof, that halachically is not called a roof. It's not called a roof, which we actually saw before. That's why, for example, if you built a structure like this, you would not be chayiv in mezuzah. Not be chayiv in mezuzah. That's actually for a different reason because there's no tzuras haPesach. But the point is over here that what constitutes an ohel that would prevent you from sitting underneath the schach, only something that satisfies the halachic criteria of being its own roof. But if it doesn't satisfy the criteria of being a roof, then the Lamaisa does not interrupt. It's not a chatzitza between you and the schach. So if you're sleeping in the bed with the 4 posts and there's mamish a roof that has at least a tefach of flat space, you're not under the schach. You're underneath that roof. However, again, if you're sleeping in the bed with the 2 posts and you're just kind of sleeping in a tent, there's no roof of a tefach. That does not invalidate your sukkah experience.
You put a tent inside a sukkah and sleep in the tent.
Technically. Right, don't get any ideas. Right. So the Gemara says the following. But yes, the answer is, according to what the Mishnah is saying, it would be absolutely fine.
And be Makai in the mitzvah.
And be right, correct. Be Makai in the mitzvah. But again, I want to be clear. On something. Right, please. This sugya continues tomorrow and the next day. So let's not pervert a little bit of knowledge over here.
If it's rainy, you want to sleep in the sukkah.
Well, so you see, that's exactly. So that's where it gets interesting, because remember, once we'll get to these sugyas. Once it's raining, there's no mitzvah of sukkah. There's no mitzvah of sukkah. So we'll see. Says
many of us live in houses.
I'm sorry?
Do all of us live in tents?
All of us live
The rest of
in.
you?
No, because so I'll tell you why not. Because generally, also, without getting technical, a certain slope that's a gradual slope within a certain amount is considered flat. So the truth is, unless you live in a house with very, very steep rooftops, everybody has some level of flat, halachically flat
The
roof.
ceiling is flat though.
I'm sorry?
The ceiling is
The ceiling is flat, right? But even the outside, remember, we actually saw some of these sugyas in Eruvin and even in Pesachim, that if the slope is a little bit more gradual, it's considered halachically flat. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amen of Chista. Lo shar elav b'nei anesher. So remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, if you spread out the sheet, when is the sheet problematic? Only if you're spreading it out to catch that which is dropping from the schach. Also, it's very interesting. But what's the inference? If I were to spread out a decorative sheet, I have a sheet. I made a nice sheet in school, right? I have a nice decorative sheet that I made, and I want to hang that up underneath the schach. So what should be the halacha? It would appear from the Mishnah that it should be okay, because the Mishnah only said the problem with the sheet is that I'm using it to catch that which falls down from the schach, which allows it to operate almost in a roof-like. Remember, because the whole chap of a roof is to protect you from the elements. This is being placed here to protect me from that which falls from the schach. It's operating in a roof capacity, but if I'm just putting it there for decorative purposes, it should be okay. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, yes, that is correct, because after all, the Mishnah said that the only time the sheet is problematic is when Lamaisef is there to catch the droppings from the schach. So the Gemara says, what would I have thought? Who I didn't feel in also. Well, I might have thought that no, you can't even put up a sheet, even if it's for decorative purposes. And the only reason the Mishnah says to catch the droppings from the schach is why? Because that's the normative reasons why people would hang up a sheet. But in Achinami, the hanging of any sheet would be problematic. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash also says it's a very important idea. We'll see if this is halacha l'maiser or not. But again, what the Gemara seems to be saying is the only time you can't hang up a sheet underneath your schach, or on top of your schach for that matter, is when the sheet itself is operating in somewhat of a roof capacity. There to block out the sun, there to go ahead and catch that which falls from the schach. But if the sheet is there for purely decorative purposes, even though it's hanging there right underneath your schach, it's okay. So the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, let's bring a halacha that seems to support this idea. If a person appropriately schacht their sukkah, I just made that into a verb, right? You schacht your sukkah, you appropriately put up your schach. The ishra bikramin, when you went ahead and you decorated it with cloths, so with colored linens and colored cloths. The talab, so I'll say here again, so you see you're decorating your sukkah with linens and cloths, with sheets. The talaba goes in and you hang from it nuts and shkedim and almonds, afarsikin and peaches and rimonim. Pomegranates also, remember, not plastic, right? This is the real thing. This is how they used to decorate their sukkahs, with real fruit. Listen to this. Parchila is actually very beautiful. Clusters of grapes. Ataro shoshu. Remember, I will say, Sukkah is the harvest season. So this is why they would go ahead and they would decorate their sukkahs with all this, like you mentioned, this real fruit. Real fruit, clusters of grapes. Ataro shel shibolin, literally wreaths of grain. Yenos, you'd hang wine. I think there's a niche market in this over here. They would suspend literally bottles of wine, flasks of wine, shmanim, oil, salasos, fine flour. Wow. In all of these cases, so most of these are all decorations in your sukkah. Asr l'histapik mehem. Now the halacha is you are not permitted to benefit from these on sukkahs. Now we'll say, so what does this mean? So I can't pour myself a glass of wine from the wine that's hanging there. I can't, chop off a grape from the one that's hanging. You can't do that. Why? Until after Sukkot. Why, Bosai? Because the idea over here is what? The idea is that Lamaisa, once you've gone ahead and designated as decorations for the Sukkah, it becomes what we call huktsasa mitzvah, set aside for a mitzvah. And once you go ahead and you set aside an object for a mitzvah, you may not use it for personal use afterwards. However, the imhisna aleim, but if you made a t'nai, now what does that mean? If you made a t'nai, Hakolafi to know. Everything follows your Tanai. Look at Rashi. Hakolafi to know. Ukigon da Amar. Any boldol mehen kol bein hashmoshel shilm tavarishon. The lo chal kedusha alei. So we'll see this later on. But for example, if a person were to be eating of those grapes, bein hashmoshel, so at the twilight period, at the onset of Yom Tov, then that's a clear demonstration that they have in mind to get benefit even from the decorations, and the decorations would not be off limits. So meaning, when the Gemara says that you can't get benefit from the decorations, that's if in an unqualified state. So if I didn't make any time, make any condition, I just hang everything up. The assumption is whatever you hang up is set aside for the mitzvah of Sukkah, is off limits for my personal use. But if I made an explicit t'nai and indicated that I plan on drinking the wine, I plan on eating the grapes, I plan on partaking of the fine flour, l'maisa, I have that right. Now we'll say, why do we bring this down? We only brought this whole brisa down for one reason, to show that decorative sheets do not disqualify the sukkah. Remember what the Gemara said before. The Gemara was explaining that based on what the Mishnah said, seems to be the only sheet that really disqualifies the sukkah is what kind of sheet? Right, a sheet that ultimately operates in some roof-like capacity, either as blocking out sun, either as catching schach droppings. But but for decoration purposes, lamaisa, it's absolutely fine. And the Gemara now just quoted this brisa, which talks about people who are decorating their sukkah with decorative sheets, which seems to support that assertion. The Gemara says, 1 second, that's not a good raya. Why? Dilma minat sad. Say, how do you know the brisa over here is talking about suspending sheets from the top of the sukkah, from the schach? Maybe he's talking about what? On the walls, wall coverings. And what the brisa is essentially saying is what? That lamaisa, you can go ahead and hang decorative sheets on the walls of your sukkah. But just realize if you do that, and then suddenly you're getting cold one night sleeping in the sukkah, you can't take that down and cover yourself with it. So there's no raya, there's no proof that it's talking about the type of sheet hanging from the schach. And therefore, again, it's not really a proof to our previous assertion. Itmar. The Gemara quotes the following statement: Noye sukkah Ein mema'atin b'sukkah. I will say, sukkah decorations do not detract from the minimum dimensions of the sukkah. Look at Rashi. Ein mema'atin kramin haprusin lamala lenoi ein mema'atin begov ha'me'esrim lahachshira delav min sichachaninu. Boss, listen to this. If you have a sukkah that's lamala me'esrim amma, and then what happens? You hang up a sheet, and the sheet now decreases the airspace, so the sukkah is now 19 amos. It's a big sheet, right? So the halacha is that the sheet cannot go ahead. The sheet does not in any way impact the dimensions of the sukkah. So what Rashi says over here is because, very simply, the sheet is not schach. Because it's not schach, it doesn't impact ultimately the dimensions of the sukkah. Because if you want to say that it is schach, you have a bigger problem, which is what? It's pasul. Pasul schach. Why Rashi says? Lashir delam min schachaninu di schach hava mifsala mishum mekabel tuma v'lo leposla mishum pchusam yud. So I will say ultimately again. So the sheet itself, you can't. The sheet itself is not schach, and if you count the sheet as schach, it could potentially invalidate the schach that you already have. Therefore, the schach itself does not. The sheet itself does not impact the dimensions of sukkah. So this would be true if decreasing the airspace of a sukkah lamal me'esrim, and this would be true if you had a sukkah that was exactly yud. Let's say a sukkah that was exactly 10 tefachim, and you hung a sheet right from the top, and therefore again now you've diminished the airspace to 9 tefachim. That sheet does not impact. It's not just sheet. The decorations do not impact the dimensions of the sukkah.
What's the hava meaning? Why would one even...
Because it's taking away airspace. It is actively removing some of the dimensions of the sukkah.
And even though it's possible, but the hava meaning is, maybe that works too.
Correct. At the end of the day, it's not a din in schach. It's taking up space. So the Gemara says, and again, the Havamina also has to do with the fact that Noye Sukkah. What do you see from the previous case? Noye Sukkah take on almost a sukkah-like status themselves. That's the chap as well. The same way that if I put up the grapes, I can't eat the grapes for the entirety of sukkah. The same way that I can't deconstruct my sukkah and use it to build a deck. So the Havamina is that the decorations are like the sukkah itself. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rav Ashi uminat sad mematin. Rav says it's very interesting. But you know what decorations do? They do diminish the dimensions from the side. Look at Rashi. Minatzad mematin la mishir zayin tfachim deha'ina machzekes roshu ruv shachanas. Listen to this. I will say, if you have a sukkah that measures exactly zayin al zayin, 7 tfachim by 7 tfachim, and you put up a very thick sheet on the side wall to serve as a tapestry, and you now the sukkah is less than zayin al zayin, the Gemara suggests that will invalidate your sukkah. Now, but what does that mean? You just told me before it doesn't invalidate the airspace. So here's the difference. You see, the minimum shear of a sukkah of zayin al zayin is a practical shear that allows what? You have to be able to get your head, most of your body, and your table in that sukkah, which means what? If you have a very thick wall hanging, and that takes away from some of the space, what's going to happen? You will not be able to do that. If you can't do that, then lamaisa again the sukkah is pasul. So the Gemara goes weiter. Uminatzad mematin. Fine. Minyamin avdei Ravashi. This is another interesting case. Minyamin, who was the servant of Ravashi, it misha la kisuna b'maya. His clothing got wet with water. V'ishtecha amat lelasa, and he hung his clothing up on the sukkah to dry. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "It mishay nishura b'mayim." So he hung his clothing on the sukkah to dry. Amr Ravashi, Dalye. Ravashi told him quickly, take it off. Delo leimru kamisachache b'davar hamakabel tuma. That was what Ravashi was concerned about. Was what? That people are going to see this and they're going to assume that this item is schach, and people are going to say, remember, Rabbi said, this is one of the beautiful dynamic ideas that we've seen many a time, which is that in the days of old, how did people learn what to do? Right, by observing their rebbeim. They observed the rebbe, they observed the teacher, and that ultimately taught me what I need to do. So here you have Ravashi all nervous that people are going to see clothing on top of the sukkah, and people will assume that what? That you could use clothing. Remember, we'll discuss why you can't use clothing. You can't use clothing as schach.
Where did he hang it?
Must have been on top of the sukkah. So the Gemara says, V'ha kachazule dirativa. But Minyamin said back to Ravashi, but people see that it's wet. And I will say again, when people see that it's wet, they'll realize that why did I put it on top of the sukkah? only to dry out and not for schach purposes. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Rav Ashi was saying to him, L'chiyavshi kamina lacha. Rav Ashi said, you're right. What I meant is, as soon as it's dry, please remove it from on top of the sukkah. Itmar. Another brayso. Noye sukkah hamuflogin mimenu arba. We'll say another very interesting case. If you have sukkah decorations that are removed from the schach for tfachim. So now we'll say, see, under normal circumstances, what you would say is, look at Rashi, Nuye sukkah, sedinin haprus and tachas schach l'noy. So let's just use the sheets, because it's the easiest thing for illustration purposes. There was more coffee in here before. Okay. So the Gemara says the following. If you have sukkah decorations that are within hamuflogim mimenum arba, that are 4 tfachim away from the schach. So meaning it's not flush against the schach, it's 4 tfachim away from the schach. Rav Nachman Amar Kshera. Rav Nachman says it's kosher. And Rav Chisda Rav Huna Amri Psula. And Rav Huna and Rav Chisda say that it's possible. So we'll say, what's happening over here? So look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Psula, Mishum Ohel Mafsik. So we'll say, listen to this. So apparently Rav Nachman seems to, well, let's actually start with Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda and Rav Huna say that if the decorations, if the decorative sheet is not within 4 tefachim of the schach, it's puzzle, meaning it invalidates the schach. Why does it invalidate the schach? Rashi says, Mishum Ohel Mafsik. Because if it's more than 4 tefachim from the schach, it becomes its own ohel, it becomes its own tent, its own structure, and ultimately invalidates the already existing schach. Va'ashtachach delo gani b'sukkah, and therefore it'll turn out that you're not underneath the schach, you're underneath the sheet. Ol Rav Nachman, kivan delinoi sukkah yahivnu b'teil legabar. I will say, on the other hand, Rav Nachman, who holds that it's kosher, holds that what? Since it's there for decorative purposes, it's bottled to the schach, even if it's more than 4 tefachim removed. Okay. So,
Related to what they said before about the oil?
Correct. About why 4 tefachim? Yes. But pashtus, yes. So the Gemara says the following. So the Gemara says, Rav Chisda v'Rav Rav Huna iklo lebei Reish Galusa. So let's listen to this. Rav Chisda and Rav Huna went to the house of the Reish Galusa. It's a very interesting case. Remember, this is Rav Chisda and Rav Huna who said that a sheet that is hanging underneath the schach, that's more than 4 tefachim away from the schach, is pasul. So Rav Chisda and Rav Huna go to visit the Reish Galusa. Remember, the Reish Galusa is the head of Babylonian Jewry. They're going to visit him on Sukkot. Why? Why? Because we will say on Regalim there is a mitzvah to go see your Rebbe. On Sukkot there's a mitzvah to go see your Rebbe. So they go to the Reish Galusa's house. Agninhu, so they were set up for accommodations. Agninhu Rav Nachman b'Sukkah shenoyeh muflag yemenu arba tefachim. So listen to this. So Rav Nachman, now who is Rav Nachman? Rashi points out Rav Nachman is Av Beis Din Haya. V'nogid u'mitzah beis Reish Galusa v'osa apiv. Rav Nachman was the head of the court in Bavel, so he was kind of the right-hand man of the Reish Galusa. So what happens? Rav Chisda and Rav Huna come to visit the Reish Galusa. Rav Nachman makes arrangements for them, and he arranges lodging in a sukkah that had a decorative sheet that was hanging more than 4 tefachim from the schach. Now I will say, remember, this is a case where Rav Nachman held that what? That it's kosher. Why? Because since it's for decoration, it's bottled to the schach. Rav Chisda and Rav Huna hold that what? That it's pasul. So he puts them in a sukkah that he holds is kosher, but they hold is pasul. And what happens? Ishtiku v'lo amru lemidi. Rav Chisda and Rav Huna didn't say a word. They didn't say a word. So Rav Nachman was intrigued by this. He said, Amr lehu haddibu rabbana mishmatayu. So Rav Nachman said to him, have the rabbis retracted their position? So I mean, he was trying to start up a little bit. So have you retracted your position? Listen to this. So the Amrulei, so Rav Chisda and Rav Huna said to him, no, anan shluchei mitzvah anan upetur min sukkah. So they said to him, no, we still hold the sukkah as pasul. Just what? We happen to be exempt from sukkah right now. Why? Because again, the halacha is shluchei mitzvah. Those who are on a mitzvah mission are pater from the sukkah, are exempt from sukkah, which is part of the general concept of osek b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah. When you are engaged in the performance of one mitzvah, you are by definition exempted from other mitzvahs. So they understood that coming to visit the Reish Galus, coming to visit the head of Babylonian Jewry, was in fact a mitzvah. Because they were engaged in that mitzvah, they were exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah. So essentially, said to Rav Nachman, put us wherever you want. Put us. So again, they didn't rate again. So we still disagree. The sukkah is not a kosher sukkah, but it's not worth the fight right now. Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, what we would say in a situation like that is that Lamaisa, try to eat foods that don't require a sukkah to begin with. But technically speaking, the answer is yes. Technically, I'm sorry?
Kashrus still fine?
Kashrus applies, yes. You can't stop at Burger King on the way, if that's what you're asking. Good, I'm happy we're having this discussion. This is important. All right, so says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Mutter lishan bekila b'sukkah. Rav Yehuda said in Shmuel, it is permitted to sleep in a kila in the sukkah. I will say, what's the kila? Look at Rashi. Kila, haprusa svio samita. So this is a canopy bed. Kila is like a canopy bed that is spread out around the bed. Va'avapi sheyesh lagag she'in gago mishupa kishal naklitin ella shava kishal kinufos. So it comes over to say in Shmuel, you could sleep underneath a canopy bed. Canopy bed. We said before that you can't sleep in a canopy bed. So Gemara says, "Avapi sheyesh lagag," even though it has a roof. So why can you sleep in it? V'hu she'ena gavoa asara. This is providing that the canopy is not 10 tfachim high. Now look at Rashi. It's a very important Rashi. Rashi says, "V'hu she'ena gavoa asara min amita." It's interesting that according to Rashi, this height is measured from what? Not from the ground, but from the surface of the bed. So apparently, again, what Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel is that in order for something to constitute an ohel, an actual structure that would prevent you from dwelling in the sukkah, it's not just enough to have a roof. What else do you need? You need height. You need height. Therefore, if the canopy is less than 10 tefachim from the bed, from the surface of the bed, that does not constitute an ohel, and therefore you could sleep underneath this canopy. So the Gemara says, the reason I say, look, now this is interesting, we'll see if halacha l'maisa, we're counting it from the bed or the floor. In any event, the Gemara says the following, Tashma, but we learned, Hayashim b'kila b'sukkah lo yatzei chavaso. But yet we learned elsewhere that if one sleeps underneath a canopy, he has not fulfilled his obligation, i.e., he's not yotzei the mitzvah of sukkah. So what's the case? So I will say it's a contradiction because we just said before that you are yotzei if you sleep underneath a canopy. Here we're saying you're not yotzei if you sleep underneath a canopy. Hacham asking on what's the case? Kishegavoa asara. Oh, the case of that brisa that said that you're not yotzei if you sleep underneath a canopy must be talking about what? A canopy that is 10 tefachim or more higher. Therefore, in that case, it's an ohel. They say the Gemara is the kasha. Hayoshein tachas amita b'sukkah lo yatzei de chavaso. But yet we learned us. We'll see this in the Mishnah that if you sleep underneath a bed. I have a bed in my sukkah. I sleep underneath that bed. I am not yotzei the mitzvah of sukkah. Why? Because the assumption is the bed itself constitutes an ohel. It constitutes a rooftop. So what do you see from that? I will say the assumption is that the bed is not going to what? Is not going to be 10 tefachim right off the ground. It's not going to be 3 feet off the ground. So the says, "Hatargim Shmuel b'mita gavoa asara." No, in Achinam Shmuel explains that the case is talking about what? Where literally the bed is 10 tefachim off the ground. So if I sleep underneath that, I'm sleeping underneath both something that has a flat roof span of at least a tefach and is 10 tefachim high. That's an ohel. Tashma. Remember the Brisa spoke about this case of where you're placing a roof on top of 4 posts, psula. So I will say again, in all of these cases where it says possible that you're sleeping underneath a canopy, it seems to be that it's possible no matter what the height is. To which the Gemara says, Hasam nami de gavihi asara. That is also talking about a case where the canopy is 10 tefachim high. Let's finish. V'halo katani hachi. But it doesn't say that. The sanya naklitin shnayim v'kinofos arba. Because we learned in the Brisa that naklitin arbosa is the case of where there are 2 posts. And the kinofos is the case where there are 4 posts. Pires al gabi kinofos psula. If you spread a canopy over 4 posts, so it's puzzle. Puzzle means that if you're underneath that canopy, you're now fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah. Agami naklitin, but if you did it on the 2 posts, it's kosher. Ubilvad shelo yihiu naklitin gavon min amita asara. As long as what? As long as it's not more than 10 tefachim high. Michlal dikinofos afapi she'en gavoa asara. So the Gemara says, but what's the inference on that? We'll say now the only time that the Brisa mentions the height requirement is in what case? In the case of the 2 posts, right? In the case of the what's the word? Naklitim. Thank you. In the case of the 2 posts, which seems to indicate what? That in the case of the 4 posts, it does, even if it's lower than 10 tefachim, the fact that it has a flat roof of a tefach, by definition, will invalidate your sukkah. So we see you don't need a 10 tefach height. So which the Gemara says no. Shiny kinofos dikavi. The difference is the 4 posts spread Rabosai is different. Why? Because it's permanent. Rashi says dikavi. Aval kila lo kavia bechazaka kikinofos hilchach kilo gofa asra lo chashas Rabosai. What the Gemara now seems to be suggesting is that there are 3 different cases. Case number 1 is the naklitim. Naklitim are the 2 posts. Are the 2 posts that form the tent that does not have a tefach flat roof. The only case where that is problematic is when if it's lamala me'asara. Right? If it's more than 10 tefachim high, then lamais again it's problematic. Case number 2 is the case of the kila. The kila is the canopy that also has a 10 tefach roof, and apparently again that's also only a case of where what? It's only problematic if what? If it's more than 10 tefachim high. The third case is the kinofos. The kinofos is the 4-post bed that is a permanent bed. That is a permanent. Those posts are permanent fixtures. That is problematic even if what? Even if it's less than 10 tefachim high, because its permanence by definition creates it into an ohel. The Gemara says, v'hare a sukkah gabi sukkah dekavia. What about the case of sukkah gabi sukkah? That was a case of permanence. V'amri Shmuel kech shera kach psula. We're back to our previous sugi. And what did Shmuel say? The upper sukkah is only problematic if what? If it has 10 tefachim of height. Right? So upper sukkah is only a sukkah if it has 10 tefachim of height. But according to what we just said, that if something is considered to be permanent, it has permanence, then what? Then it should be problematic even if it's less than 10 tefachim of height. Amri, the Gemara says, no. Hasam de la mifsal sukkah ba'asara. It's apples and oranges. There, when we come to say what makes, meaning we're trying to figure out the minimum dimensions of a sukkah, that requires 10 tefachim. Because Shmuel says that's less than 10 tefachim. It's not a sukkah. Hacha de la shavuye ohel. But here, when it comes to we're not talking about sukkah, here we're talking about the minimum definition of an ohel. When it comes to an ohel, bitsir me'asara nami havi ohala. When it comes to an ohel, Rabbosai, even something less than 10 tefachim could ultimately be considered an ohel. So the Gemara essentially answers in, it's apples and oranges. When it comes to a sukkah, the reason Shmuel said 10 tefachim is because that's the minimum shear for a sukkah. It's not a sukkah less than 10 tefachim of height. Here, apparently when it comes to ohel, ohalim or ohalos come in different forms and different sizes, depending on the nature of the item being discussed. And therefore, Lamaisa, in this case, when something is such a permanent structure, even less than 10 tefachim will in fact create an ohel. All right, we'll stop over here. I'm sorry?